57talk.com. Gary Cubetta back with you again, Scottsdale, Arizona. And my pleasure to introduce once again Larry Matysik. Larry, great to have you back.
Hey, it's always fun, as I said that before, and I say that all the time. That's because it is always fun, and this in particular should be because we're really going to go back in time into some history, but it has kind of a special feel, a really nostalgic feel for me because it's back when I was a kid, and yet here, years later, when I became somebody who worked for Sam Muchnick, was in the office with people like Sam Muchnick and Wild Bill Longson and seeing Lou Thez and meeting some of these people in person and Gene Kiniski and all the rest, and hearing the stories about what went on sometimes behind the scene of the matches from when wrestling at the Chase began in May of 1959 and some of those great bouts in 59 all through the 60s. What an incredibly hot, what an incredibly golden era for wrestling everywhere, and particularly in St. Louis.
Larry, I pre-read some of the notes because I'm not familiar. This is before I was born. I was born in 1962, so a lot of these guys I never saw, and I wanted to get a little preparation. Talk to me about what wrestling was like on TV in St. Louis before you guys, St. Louis, went on KPLR
TV.
Right.
Right. Well, wrestling really across the country, it had a very hot period in the early 1950s on the Dumont Network with a national show. There was a lot of wrestling on television, but the Dumont show coming out of Chicago had people worried about that national promotion, that somebody was going to take over all of wrestling. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It didn't happen because basically wrestling became incredibly overexposed, and the thing died. And television took wrestling off the air, and there were a couple scandals, and that didn't hurt things either, didn't help things either. So in the mid-'50s, into the late 50s, wrestling really was in a depression across the country. And as Sam Muchnick, the promoter in St. Louis, often said, most towns lost money because they needed, by that point, television. They didn't know how, they didn't know why, but they found out that somehow television was a necessary ingredient to make wrestling work. One of the first television stations to bring wrestling back turned out to be KPLR in St. Louis. It was an independent television station, independent of ABC, CBS, and NBC, which were the three networks. Harold Koppler and his family began a station, and he also owned the Chase Park Plaza Hotel, which was the hotel, the place of all high society, the place of every big event, from the baseball writers' dinner to the Veiled Prophet Parade ball. That was all there in the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. But Sam, because of his connections in St. Louis, had somehow survived the 50s comfortably enough. He said we never lost money. In fact, in the 1950s, there were two promotions in St. Louis. One was the Mississippi Valley Sports Club, and one was Sam Muchnick Promotions. The only thing was, nobody knew it, Sam Muchnick owned half of the Mississippi Valley Sports Club as well. So basically, he was booking the matches for both the clubs. When he made his deal with Harold Koppler in early 1959 to begin wrestling at the Chase, the two clubs merged. There were different minority partners in both Sam Muchnick's program and the Mississippi Valley Club, which was basically Lou Thez, his father Martin Thez, and Wild Bill Longson. A deal was made. Thez dropped out completely because he wanted to step away from wrestling at the time. He dropped the NWA belt at the time. Wild Bill Longson became a partner with Sam Muchnick, along with Whipper Billy Watson, Frank Tunney in Toronto, Eddie Quinn in Montreal, and they were all among the partners when the St. Louis Wrestling Club was formed in 1959 for the first show on Channel 11, KPLR TV in St. Louis. And the success that wrestling at the Chase had really, I won't say it made it happen, but it helped similar things happen for other promotions around the country. Here was St. Louis having this highly rated show that everybody was talking about, and suddenly, well, they wanted to do the same thing in Chicago. They wanted to do the same thing in Tampa. They wanted to do the same thing in Dallas, the same thing in Minneapolis, what have you. And pretty soon, by the early 1960s, wrestling was on television everywhere, generally on independent stations in very good markets.
So Larry, let's say 1958. You're a young man. What do you?
Young man, I was 11 years old. I was turning 11.
11. So what's on TV before KPLR? Were there like 3 channels of wrestling, or were there no channels of wrestling?
No channels of wrestling. Basically, and I want to say it was the ABC affiliate here in St. Louis. They were running the old tape out of Texas from the mid-1950s, as Texas still had television wrestling off and on during that period, Texas Wrestling with Vess Box. And so in that period, there was Gene Kelly, real name Gene Kiniski. There was Lou Thez. There was Ray Gunkel. There was Iron Mike DiBiase. There was Bulldog Danny Pletchis. There was Ray Gunkel. There was Bobby Manigoff, Duke Kiamuka, various people like that. And I'd watch that show. So I was already half hooked. And right at the very end of that early 1950s era, Sam Muchnick had been on TV in St. Louis with Channel 5. Very short-lived program. I remembered as a youth, like 6, 7 years old, remembered seeing wrestling. Of course, my parents talked about it. My dad was a huge wrestling fan, not unlike so many other adults in St. Louis. So I was ready when Wrestling at the Chase came back on. I was ready to watch it. I'd been seeing the stuff from Texas, and here all of a sudden was wrestling from St. Louis. And I was getting into writing, and I was doing a lot of various writing for a local newspaper. Actually, at the age of 12, I got a couple things published, and this wrestling and baseball and sports were my thing. And that's when Wrestling at the Chase started with Joe Garagiola.
May 23rd, 1959, the very first show.
The very first show, and Joe Garagiola, the announcer. At that time, he was the color commentator for St. Louis Cardinal baseball, along with Harry Carey and Jack Buck, two famous names in sports broadcasting. So you had this tremendous connection, and here was wrestling in this gorgeous ballroom. People sitting at tables at the ringside, coat and tie, women actually in evening gowns, pearls, diamonds on, being served food and getting themselves all excited about wrestling. Joe Garagiola said it best. He just recently did an interview with Dave Meltzer about Gene Kiniski's death, and he said, told Dave, he says, it wasn't really a wrestling event. It was a social event. And that's what made wrestling so amazing, because here were all these people from all walks of life, people that you wouldn't expect to be there, and they were in love with this spectacle called wrestling, and the groundwork was really solidified for what would happen over the next 25 years in St. Louis.
On the trip to St. Charles for the Mike Palermo Super Show, I got the chance to see the Corzan room. It's split in half now, but you could almost feel that something special had happened there many, many, many years ago.
Oh, many miracles. And they can do a lot of things with that room. The actual room still exists. The Chase Park Plaza Hotel has been sold, rebought, and reformed, and a lot of different things have happened in there. They've moved a lot of rooms around. But the Corzan room, when they do have it completely open, which isn't all that often, is actually still in the same alignment that it was for wrestling. I did a show in 2000 for our Channel 11, which is called Wrestling at the Chase, a look back. And we were able to go in the Corzan room, and we put a ring up right in the spot where the ring had been back in 1959. Blew the smoke machines and everything, and here I was walking out of the smoke into the wrestling ring at the Corzan room. Believe me, it was a neat feeling. It was an eerie feeling, because I thought the ghosts are watching me. They're all there watching me. Sam Muchnick and everyone, they're all watching, because this is where wrestling hit a different level.
Larry, I was surprised when I went in the room. It doesn't have a particularly high ceiling, does it? It's not like it's,
not an arena setting, but it gets high enough. And, of course, with those chandeliers, the fancy chandeliers hanging down, that makes it seem a little lower. But it was good enough for wrestling.
Okay.
And actually, ironically, if you went to the east side of that room, on exactly the other side of the wall, there's a door hidden back there in the corner, and that would actually be the stage for the Corzan room when they have a banquet or something, or a concert. If you go through that little door, the other side of that door is where the control room was for Channel 11. So it's perfect for taping Wrestling at the Chase.
Did you, 11 years old, did you go to the TV tapings or just watch on TV?
Not the first ones. No, I was watching on TV.
Okay, fair enough.
And it took me a while. I started going there, and for one thing, they didn't let you in until you were 16.
Okay, so we got 5 years to go. Okay, so where should we start? The first TV taping?
Well, I'd say that's one, because that's one I did note.
Okay.
And just run through the names, because some historians will remember these names. So Jim LaRock, who was a great amateur wrestler from Iowa, by the way, and the Mighty Atlas, one of the first strongmen, went to a 10-minute draw. Rip Hawk, who became one of the most controversial figures here because of his interaction with Joe Garagiola, beat a gentleman who nobody ever heard of again, Ray Spindola. And then in the main event, which was 2 out of 3 falls, Whipper Billy Watson, one of the all-time greats, a Hall of Famer from Toronto and a partner in the St. Louis Wrestling Club, defeated Bob Orton, better known as the grandfather of today's Randy Orton and the father of Cowboy Bob Orton. But to show you how the time situation was, it was a 2 out of 3 fall match. Watson won the first fall, But the television show time ran out at 1 hour. They were still wrestling. So they finished the match off TV, and the nenext week on TV, Joe Garagiola noted that Watson had won 2 straight falls last week. We ran out of time. Sam Muchnick, Bobby Bruns, who was his booker, Wild Bill Longson, they all had to learn how to use TV, too. Even they did, as smart as they were back in 1959. There was a learning process going on.
What did you think of Joe? Now, I remember Joe from the 70s and the 80s. He was a premier baseball broadcaster for NBC. Today, he really, I don't believe he does any more baseball. He's a little bit older, of course.
He's 84, 85.
Yeah, that's hard to believe because he was one of the top guys in the business. Did you like him instantly doing the wrestling?
Sure, but I was a sports fan. Hey, I was, in 1959, I just turned 12 years old.
Yeah.
I was hooked on sports and baseball, and Joe was good because he had a real, and it's always did in all his broadcasts, he had that common touch. You never felt that you were being talked down to, and he had a great sense of humor. You could pick up on the things. The interaction throughout 59, 60, 61 between himself and Gene Kiniski, who was the other big heel at the time, really helped get the show over. Rip Hawk would come out of a headlock, and they'd have a close-up of Rip's face, blonde-headed guy, big nose and everything. And Joe Garagiola would say, boy, back in the old neighborhood of the Hill where all the Italians are in St. Louis, if we saw something like that come out of the sewer, we'd think it was a soccer ball and start kicking it. And Rip Hawk would yell in the ring, because he would hear that at ringside, and he'd yell back at Joe Garagiola, and they'd start like 2 baseball jockeys, bench jockeys getting on each other. Same thing with Gene Kiniski. The interaction was great, never planned. And just one thing led to another, and it was like a side attraction to the things that happened in the ring, but it just added something extra, something that wasn't choreographed, something that was not planned, something that was not scripted. Here it was. And Garagiola's interaction with Gene Kiniski and Rip Hawk, I believe, and I think Sam Muchnick believed, was certainly a major part of why wrestling became so popular so quickly, because he could talk about then on the baseball game. Here's Harry Carey. They're in the 6th inning of a game between the Cardinals and the Cubs, and Harry Carey brings up, he says, hey, I hear you had an argument with Gene Kiniski on that Wrestling at the Chase show. And this is going out over KMOX radio, which at the time dominated the Midwest from Minneapolis down to probably New Orleans, and from Kansas to Indiana. KMOX was all over, and all of a sudden here they were talking about Wrestling at the Chase.
October 9th, 1959, Kiel Auditorium. Now, you don't have to be 16 to go to Kiel, right?
Nope, that was one of the first shows I was at. And again, as I put these records together, and you and I have talked about this, and you've been very kind about it, these records are coming from my own files. And, of course, we used it to put together the book, The Golden Era of Wrestling in St. Louis, the St. Louis Wrestling Record Book, which is distributed through ECW Press. You can go to ecwpress.com, get your own copy. Follow along with us as we go through various matches and just various things that catch Gary's eye and catch my eye, and just different things we should talk about. So I was learning, too, in 1959. I wasn't keeping track of the TV at that time. I was by the middle of 1960. But luckily I had these original house show matches, and so many of these records, as we've talked about in our earlier discussions here on 57 Talk, they were destroyed in the closing of the St. Louis Wrestling Club, sadly lost. There are still some programs that are distributed around in the Muchnick family, son Dick and Richard and daughter Kathy. They might have some files buried somewhere where they have some of the old programs for 59, 60. I have all these. Anything we talk about from here on in the programs, I'll have all that, and plus my own list of what happened at the matches. But I was still getting good enough to keep track of everything, and we didn't have all the attendance figures at first. But I got better on that pretty quick because I thought I was going to be a sports journalist. And here I saw, the Cardinal baseball games, the St. Louis Hawk NBA basketball games, they list the attendance every night. I guess I should keep track and find out the attendance of every wrestling show, and I found out how to do it. And by 1960, we're starting to figure it out, so I'm learning too. Hey, I was just a kid, Gary, and you weren't even born.
Yeah, that's right. Now, you're at this show, October 9th, 1959. Now, I picture all this happening in black and white, but...
That's a Tide picture, too.
But do you look back and see it in color, or do you see it how do you see it as you look back that long ago?
Smoky, foggy. It's a memory. We're talking 51 years ago, Gary. And it's just images of a ring. What do you see as you look back to when you were 11 and 12? Maybe the first time you went to a Major League Baseball game or a Major League Hockey game.
Yeah.
How you see those images. But wrestling had so many outlandish characters, personalities, that those kind of stand out. And certainly in that time, I mean, the main event that night was Lou Thez and Cowboy Bob Ellis winning 2 out of 3 falls from Rip Hawk and Gene Kiniski. And, of course, in my youthful imagination and vivid pictures of these guys, Hawk and Kiniski just stood out, and Ellis was such a baby face, and Lou Thez was God. You know, so God was in the ring wrestling. What an amazing thing that was. You know, I didn't know God could deliver a drop kick so well. And he pinned Rip Hawk for the 3rd fall, by the way. So it was quite a night, and I remember why I made a note here, and you're looking at Kenji Shibuya, who just passed away recently, defeated Thor Hagen after the ring ropes collapsed. Well, what would stick in your mind? It was an unplanned spot. The ring rope popped out. I found out later, you know, those things can happen if something happens. And at Kiel Auditorium, because it was a city-owned building, the city engineers, the city stagehands, put up the ring. Wrestling people didn't put up the ring. So, especially after this, I found out later that Sam would send Wild Bill Longson down when the union people were putting the ring up to make sure they had everything tight. And I just remember that the ropes collapsing in the middle of the match and Shibuya going on to win, while half the ropes were down in the middle of the ring, and Shibuya's going ahead with the judo chops, the vicious judo chops, to Thor Hagen and getting a pin. And, of course, everybody thought, well, the only reason Shibuya won was because the rope collapsing distracted Thor Hagen. And there's one other name, of course, that sticks out on that because it's one of the very, very few times he was ever in St. Louis. Argentina Rocca was on the card and got a victory over a guy by the name of Roberto Pico.
What was Argentina like to see live? Because I've heard a lot over the years that, you know, he flew around the ring too much for that particular time in wrestling. What was your reaction to him?
My memory now, and even then, the first thing that comes to mind is acrobat, not wrestler, acrobat. And I guess maybe Sam thought the same way because he didn't bring him here very much either, although we'll see his name pop up once more when the Buddy Rogers, NWA, Lou Thez, Bruno Sammartino controversy erupts, and we can talk about it a little bit then. My only real memory of Rocca bouncing around, did some colorful, exciting, neat things, but I could see he wasn't Lou Thez, Cowboy Bob Ellis, Rip Hawk, or Gene Kiniski.
Was it? Were you nervous in an arena like that with the smoke? And was it a lot of older people? Were the young kids there? What was the atmosphere?
There were kids there. Yeah, there were kids there. I would. And again, this is when wrestling was just starting. And it's ironic. I wish I'd been at the one earlier. I know Sam had another card after Wrestling at the Chase started before October 9th. I think he had 2. And I want to say it was back in July of '59. And I guess someday I should go over to the St. Louis Public Library and look it up because I know the Globe Democrat kept the results. And I may even still have them buried in a scrapbook somewhere. He had a match between the card with a double main event. It was Rip Hawk versus Gorgeous George and Cowboy Bob Ellis versus Gene Kiniski. And I know Rip Hawk beat Gorgeous George, and mainly because Jeff Sharkey wrote a great article about Rip Hawk for the Cauliflower Alley Club, and in it, Hawk mentioned to Jeff Sharkey that he knew he was over in St. Louis when he got a main event with Gorgeous George, and he beat him. That would have been in July of '59, but I don't have the exact date. Come on, Jeff, look it up for us, buddy.
Okay. Let's go to the next one. October 30th, 1959, Kiel Auditorium.
And they had a return match with Ellis and Thez against Hawk and Kiniski again. The first one had a disqualification in the second fall, so they brought him back in a return match. And this one, Kiniski and Ellis traded falls, with Thez again winning the third fall by pinning Rip Hawk, which, of course, was a happy match for Thez. And Kenji Shibuya had a rematch with Thor Hagen where the ring stayed in one piece, Shibuya winning. Dick Hutton, who had lost his world heavyweight title to Pat O'Connor at the start of 1959. Dick Hutton was there, beat Ray Garden, an excellent amateur wrestler out of New Zealand, in one of my early interviews. And as I have some of the preliminaries here, one other name that should be brought up, Farmer Marlin, who was actually a very colorful and popular preliminary guy, beat Otto von Krupp, who would become Boris Malenko of Florida fame, and who, of course, is the father of Dean Malenko, now an agent for WWE.
And Dick Hutton.
Wrestling, everything has a string that ties together. You know that, Gary.
Yeah, it sure seems that way. Dick Hutton, I can't even picture him. Give me some.
I don't really have much of a memory of him, and I guess as much of a memory as I have. And he was on a couple other cards here, and we'll be on the next two shows. Bland, not as colorful. His personality did not come out as a Hawk or as a Kiniski. As I came to learn the business better, and I got into my college years, and certainly by the time I was working for Sam in the late 60s and 1970 on, and I heard people talk about Hutton, I realized that what Dick Hutton was a great technician, a tremendous technical wrestler. Lou Thesz said he was one of the best he'd ever seen, which is why he was willing to drop the title to him in 1957. But Hutton didn't draw money because he just wasn't a character. And wrestling, I guess, was going through a change then, too, where that just a solid wrestler, just a great wrestler, wasn't quite enough. You had to have some personality pop out, and I think that would describe Dick Hutton. I think those who saw Hutton and can remember Hutton, and there are some, from 59, early 60s, would say, yeah, terrific wrestler, but not at all an explosive personality. And, of course, you got to draw money. It's a two-part question when you're a wrestler, especially in those days. You had to be a tough guy. You had to be a wrestler. But it was becoming more and more important, even then, to become a personality.
November 27th, 1959, Kiel Auditorium, 9,000 plus. NWA champion Pat O'Connor and Lou Thesz, 1 hour draw. And
the first of many. I can remember thinking, wow, I didn't know people could go that long, that fast, and not collapse. I mean, they were two great athletes. And, of course, Thesz earned that title match by the last two tag matches where he'd won the deciding fall over top people. Great wrestling match, a scientific match, such as it was. Thesz, of course, the hometown hero, but Pat O'Connor, a big favorite. When Pat O'Connor got the NWA title on January 9th, 1959 by defeating Dick Hutton, the decisions that were made to make Pat O'Connor the champion, I later learned, caused a lot of the problems and helped cause the formation of the AWA, because the other guy who wanted that title was Vern Gagne, and he felt he deserved it. He'd become a big national star off the Dumont Network, and he was very big in the promotion, of course, in Minneapolis. And whatever maneuvering happened behind the scenes was enough to finally upset Gagne, and eventually he became the AWA champion, claiming that title and finding a way to get the lineage to him through a bout that Lou Thesz and Edouard Carpentier had. It was a very complicated thing. You know, Gary, as we talked in 57 Talk, and we were talking about what happened here in St. Louis in the late 80s, or in the early 80s, 82, 83. And, you know, there were some very hard times on a personal level. Now we're looking back at something in 59, and it's almost hard to realize. For us, we're looking at it very historically, very unemotionally, perhaps, subjectively. But you can imagine, for the people who were in the middle of that fight, the Gagnes, the Sam Muchnicks, the Jim Barnetts, the people that were manipulating and doing things, the Pat O'Connors, the Theszes, it was a pretty emotional time for them, too. And that's one of the things, when O'Connor became the champion for the NWA, it led to the formation of the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, and Vern Gagne becoming champion.
Well, yeah, of course, and at that time, they were the Vince McMahons of wrestling, and they were the movers and shakers, and like you said, a very emotional time for them.
Oh, without question. Good card on that in 1959, six-man tag, Cowboy Bob Ellis, Whipper Billy Watson, and Ray Garden, beating Rip Hawk, Kenji Shibuya, and Dick Hutton, a 2-out-of-3 fall match. Lorraine Johnson, really tough lady wrestler, one of the good ones, beat Jessica Rogers, and on the undercard, Thor Hagen beat Stan Lazowski, and Stan Lazowski was the brother of Reggie, who later would become the Crusher. And both the Lazowski brothers had worked in St. Louis days during the no-TV period, during the 1950s, Stan and Reggie. This was Stan, and of course Reggie became the Crusher later. And we'll have plenty to talk about on him in the mid-60s. He had a nice run here.
Did they have the same look?
Yeah, muscular, bulldog, thick, heavy, strong type guy. Thor Hagen was a solid mid-level guy. His name will pop up a lot in the middle of cards here in 59, 60, 61, 62. He is one of those journeyman guys that fit right in the middle of the card. Everybody liked him, and out of the ring, he was kind of a tough guy. And it's something that wrestling, as we've talked about before, just lacks today. It's those in-between guys that can teach you so much, that young guys could learn so much by being in the ring with him. Thor Hagen was a handy guy to have on a card, and as you'll see, never any St. Louis main events, but a lot of big matches on television, his name popping up throughout, and even long after he was past his prime, Sam respected that and still gave him a chance to earn a living.
December 11th, 1959, Kiel Auditorium, 6,000 estimate for the attendance.
And I'm sure that was a disappointment, because here was the rematch, Pat O'Connor against Dick Hutton. Hutton won the second fall, but O'Connor took the first and third falls. O'Connor retains the title. And in the semifinal, the card was dressed up. Here was Killer Kowalski, who'd been a huge star in St. Louis in the 50s, against Gene Kiniski. The two big monster brawlers, head-to-head, boom, boom, boom. And it turned into a wild match that led to Wild Bill Longson helping to break up the match. In the process, Longson and Kiniski got into it, as they had once before on television when Kiniski and Cowboy Bob Ellis had a brawl. But this time it led to Longson giving Kiniski a pile driver, knocking him cold in the middle of the Kiel Auditorium ring. I can still remember that. Whoa, that was a pile. Whoa, Kiniski's knocked out. Bill Longson's retired. I didn't know. Bill was at the end of his career. He still was actually taking some dates. But what a bear of a man he was. And he still had tremendous respect from the people in St. Louis. When he knocked out Kiniski, everybody wanted to see what would happen.
How was Killer Kowalski at this time? Because I remember later in his career, and he was always a great athlete, but he kind of slowed down a little bit. I think we talked about it in St. Louis. How was he in 59-60?
I still remember him as muscular, but this was right in that period where he became a vegetarian and he lost a lot of weight. He really was a bodybuilder type in the 50s. And then somewhere around the 60-61 area where he became much more slender, and that became more pronounced as the 60s went on. He still was a pretty big, strong guy now. And Kiniski and Kowalski, they were the two animals. So that was a match. Here you had O'Connor and Hutton, which pretty much was a scientific match. Hutton wasn't really a heel. And here was Kiniski and Kowalski. They just went in there in 8 minutes, tore the building apart, and tried to wreck each other, and ended up Bill Longson wrecked Kiniski.
Larry, are you going to every show now? Is it something you're really enjoying and committed to?
I'm hooked.
You're hooked, yeah.
We're there. Either my dad or I had a friend who was a school teacher, lived next door. We go with them. I had another friend from school. His dad was an eye doctor. He'd take us. But one way or another, I got there.
Was it a long ride, difficult to get to, or?
Well, you didn't have the highway system. It was just really being built in 1959. It was probably about a 40, 45-minute drive from where I lived, and later became like a half-hour drive.
What was it about it that you liked? Was it the main event? Was it just the atmosphere? Was it what really? The
atmosphere was like stepping into a Twilight Zone. It was just like stepping into some magical place where you had all these characters, and you could go home and relive the matches in your head. And then you could all of a sudden start putting them together in different ways. God, I guess I was a booker when I was 12, 13 years old. Well, geez, they could have put Ellis against Kowalski, and they could have put Kiniski against Watson, and you all of a sudden you're playing these games in your head. And I have a feeling that all your listeners, if they like this as much as we do, and they wouldn't be here if they didn't, they probably do the same things today, or they did it when they first saw wrestling.
Now, when I was 11, that would be 1973, and I was a little bit suspicious about wrestling, but I still wasn't 100% sure about it being on the up and up. What was your feeling at the time?
At that age, I think I still felt part of it was real. Or if I knew it wasn't, I didn't want to accept that.
Okay.
You didn't want to, let's just take it for what it is. And it's funny, the situation, and this lasted really well into the 60s. Bobby Bruns was the booker, and he was a rough, tough, old-looking character. And, of course, Wild Bill Longson was an old wrestler smoking his big cigars. He was a big, old, tough guy. And whenever some big moment would happen on Wrestling at the Chase, maybe twice a year, probably no more than that, Longson and Bruns would run to the ring to help the referees restore order. And I still can remember now that feeling in the audience and what you'd hear. Oh, it's real now. It got out of control. Sam had to send Longson and Bruns down to settle it down. And you could just hear it. I remember later on at Kiel Auditorium when I started sitting at ringside in the mid-'60s, every now and then Sam would have Bill walk down. Something I guess wasn't going right that he didn't like in the ring, and Longson would walk down to ringside, be smoking his cigar. Everybody'd see him. And he didn't do anything then. But you could hear everybody in this first 5, 6, 7 rows of ringside saying, oh, look out now. Something happened. Longson's down there. It's real. Funny world, isn't it?
Was Joe Garagiola ever at the Kiel?
I don't recall seeing him. I understand. I mean, he was there sometimes, but don't forget he in addition to doing baseball games in the summer and spring, he also had a lot of other commitments in the media, although he hadn't gone to NBC. That would happen later, and by the time we get to 62, 63, we'll be talking about that. But he was there sometimes, but not always, because he was a busy guy. He was in demand. He was a big name.
Yeah. Okay, January 8th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium. Gene Kiniski defeats Wild Bill Longson.
Very good. When the referee ruled Longson could not continue due to leg cramps, and basically blamed it on his age. He did his trademark leap over the top rope, trying to go after Kiniski in this case, and when he came down, he twisted his leg and was injured and could not continue, thus Kiniski winning the match. And the co-feature was Cowboy Bob Ellis, popular, truly popular star at that time, against that Oriental terror, Kinji Shibuya, by way of California, and Ellis beat Shibuya.
Sonny Myers and Rip Hawk go to a draw. The Red Scorpion, the famed Red Scorpion, defeats Thor Hagen. And the Midgets. What'd you think of the Midgets?
Hilarious. Loved them. 2 out of 3 fall match with Lard Littlebrook, who I learned later, of course, was booking the Midgets and training many of them. Lard Littlebrook and Cowboy Bradley against Bull Brummel and Tiny Rowe. Thing that sticks out in my mind, I still remember it now. Cowboy Bradley looked pretty tall. He had to be like 4'5", so he was bigger than everybody, and they're thinking, oh, he's almost a big guy.
Okay, here we go. January 22nd, 1960, Kiel Auditorium. Rip Hawk and Gene Kiniski over Whipper Billy Watson and Wild Bill Longson.
And, of course, this turned out to be Longson's last match in St. Louis. 2 out of 3 fall match. First fall, Watson pins Hawk. Second fall, Kiniski pins Longson. Third fall, Hawk pins Watson after Kiniski slammed Watson outside the ring. This was starting of a feud between Kiniski and Watson, which those, of course, who've looked into the history of wrestling and have seen since Gene Kiniski did just pass away and saw his history and the tremendous feuds he had that set Canada on fire with Whipper Billy Watson, well, it was going to be translated to St. Louis now here, too. But this was Longson's final match in St. Louis. He was having a lot of back trouble. Years were catching up with him. But he gave that tag match, and, of course, they got Hawk and Kiniski back with a main event win over 2 famous former world champions in Watson and Longson.
February 5th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, 10,000 in attendance. NWA champion Pat O'Connor versus Cowboy Bob Ellis.
And O'Connor wins when Ellis is counted out outside the ring in a 1 fall to a finish match. Unusual because most title matches had been 2 out of 3 falls and were 2 out of 3 falls after this. But this was a 1 fall match, and it's funny how these things pop into your head and that you remember. So now we're talking 50 years ago. I can still remember Ellis somehow Ellis took a tumble outside the ring. So did O'Connor. O'Connor's back in first. Ellis gets on the apron. O'Connor hits him with a drop kick that sends him flying off the apron. O'Connor's in the ring, gets up. Ellis is outside the ring, does not beat the count. And so that kind of made O'Connor kind of a subtle heel for the evening, that he'd done something a little tricky to keep the belt.
Pat O'Connor is NWA champion. We've talked about Pat as he was the booker. What was he a good champion to watch or so-so?
No, he was good. I mean, he was a wrestler. He had a good psychology. Everybody loved him as a worker, as, of course, I found out as time went on. Yeah. His matches were very exciting. I don't know that he was a huge drawing card, but he was a good drawing card. There were some who would say he's a little bit bland personality-wise, and I don't think he was a particularly good interview. And once again, in 1960, 50 years ago, we're getting into a period now where the ability to talk, the ability to show your personality on air is starting to become more important. Not that Pat couldn't do it, but he wasn't just a terribly outgoing person. He was one of my early interviews, too, for Sam Muchnick later, a little bit down the road, and I didn't find him very outgoing at the time, and truthfully, my first interview with him, I thought he was kind of a blah personality. Yeah. And he was okay, but nothing spectacular. He was, in the ring, a tremendous wrestler.
Larry, talk to me a little bit about the relationship between KPLR and Sam and, how it was set up. Basically,
it was the best deal in the country in wrestling. KPLR TV paid for all production. Sam didn't have to pay a thing. The St. Louis Wrestling Club didn't pay. KPLR TV gave $1,500 for every taping session to Sam to pay talent. In return, Sam gave them 5% of the house after net. No money changed hands until the end of the year. They just kept an accounting throughout the year. And at the end of the year, whoever owed who money paid it. And this case was almost all, as far as at the time, certainly I was with Sam, it was all Sam having to pay them, which, as Sam explained, was good because that means we had a good year. If our 5% is more than what they're paying, and also involved, and there were some handshake basic agreements that we get 30 spots on TV and some minor things like that, minor promotional spots. But that was the gist of the deal, and really there was never anything in handwriting. I think by the time we got into the mid to late 70s and different general managers were coming in, they thought, well, we better formalize it and have a contract. But during the 60s, there was no contract between Sam Muchnick and Harold Koppler. It was a handshake agreement. They'd been together on an airplane. They actually wrote out the deal on one of the napkins on the airplane, and that was the deal. And they lived by it. And for St. Louis, it was great. And Sam always would complain, of course, that other promoters rushed in too quick. They'd always offer to pay. We'll pay for production. We'll pay for this. And pretty soon they created much more mountain that they had to climb to get into a profit position. Where in St. Louis, because KPLR-TV was paying for a lot of the production, that was a big help for the partners in the St. Louis Wrestling Club. On the other hand, and I think we may have touched on this, if we talked about the late 70s and early 80s, the St. Louis Wrestling Club did not own the tapes, KPLR-TV did. And if they wanted to syndicate those shows, they could have. So Joe Garagiola often had mentioned that he said to Sam, the show is so popular, we should syndicate it, and Sam would just kind of laugh it off. It wasn't Sam's decision anyway, and he wouldn't have wanted to do that for fear of causing more promotional problems, knowing what a promotional and political cesspool, when you get into things like that, putting your tape on in somebody else's territory could be. But it wouldn't have been his decision, and it wasn't his decision later on when the tape was sometimes syndicated in Detroit and Philadelphia. That was up to KPLR-TV. But they were not that terribly aggressive with it. They were happy to have it right where it was, what was quickly becoming a St. Louis institution.
February 19th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, Gene Kiniski versus Whipper Billy Watson, main event.
And the feud's building very quickly. They'd had an incident on television where they got into it. In this case, Watson was disqualified for throwing Gene Kiniski over the top rope, and they finished up at the Donnybrook where everybody had to be pulled apart. The undercard's worth mentioning because Kinji Shibuya and Tairo Miyake went to a draw with Sonny Myers and Cowboy Bob Ellis. This was somewhat during a period right when or right after Sonny Myers had sued the National Wrestling Alliance and Pinky George, who was one of the early NWA founders, for trying to force him out of wrestling. Yet here was Sam using Sonny Myers in St. Louis. I'm sure there were politics involved there. Rip Hawk and Gory Guerrero going to a draw. Gory Guerrero, the patriarch of the Guerrero family, Eddie and Chavo and all those people. So, interesting evening of wrestling right there.
March 4th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, 11,501 come to see the first Texas death match ever in St. Louis, Gene Kiniski versus Whipper Billy Watson.
What a night. And also, when I wrote the article about this match, I sent it to Ring Magazine. And bless their heart, they printed it. Which at the time, Ring Magazine was a big boxing magazine with a small wrestling section. And I thought, well, let's try it. I'll just send it and see what happens. By golly, they put it in. Me talking about the first ever Texas death match, and we'll talk more about Texas death matches as they go along. But certainly in this case, this was a real Texas death match. They went I believe they went 5 falls. The conditions were falls do not count. Anything goes but strangling. All falls do is create a 30-second rest period. The finish comes when one man concedes or cannot continue. And that meant cannot continue actually by the reference of the referee, but the finish was such that when you were done, you were done. You were, quote, dead, close quote. And in this case, Kiniski delivered something like 7 backbreakers in a row to Watson, and Watson couldn't get up. And after the rest period, Watson was flat on his back. I can remember him holding on the ropes, selling the backbreakers, and there was no question in anybody's mind that Kiniski had won the match, even though Watson, if I'm not mistaken, had won 3 of the 5 falls up to that point. It was a Texas death match. It was a blow-off, and Kiniski won it over Whipper Billy Watson, first time ever. And, of course, as we know, the Texas death match over the years would be twisted and turned until it really didn't mean much of anything. But back in this time, and for the next 6-7 years, as you'll see as we go through these attendance figures, you'll see what a Texas death match meant in St. Louis.
Would it be considered heavy violence if someone had the tape today, or not really?
It might be to some extent, because everything was so stiff. In some ways, what it looked like, if it was the right guys in the match, except for some of the obvious bumps that were works. But if it weren't for a couple of obvious bumps, in some ways it looked like a UFC match.
Wow.
Stiff. And Kiniski, trust me, was stiff in those days. Co-feature we should mention, because you mentioned the famous Red Scorpion. He lost to Cowboy Bob Ellis and was unmasked as Nick Roberts, who was a strong wrestler and promoter from the Amarillo, West Texas area.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see. You've got some comments here about the Texas Death Match. Do you want to go over this later or work this?
Yeah, why don't we talk about that later? Because how it got changed as it started to come. But trust me when I say, losing a Texas Death Match did not mean you were finished. And you're going to see some people losing death matches, including Dick the Bruiser, including Fritz von Erich, who continued to draw for years and years and years because the match was done right. And at this point, the Texas Death Matches, it wasn't that mentality of, how do we get out of it? Let's count to 10, and one guy will be on his knee at 9, and the other guy will just get up at 10. Well, he really didn't lose. No. Texas Death Match. Loser is, quote, dead.
Done. Okay, March 18th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium. Main event, Cowboy Bob Ellis versus Rip Hawk.
And Ellis gets a win. Good heel babyface match, was not a sellout, I know that much. They gave Nick Roberts a co-feature against Tyro Miyake. Roberts winning over Miyake, a colorful little character who formed a good tag team with Kenji Shibuya, and we're going to be talking about that more. Joe Garagiola has said often and said it recently, the best commercial that he ever did on television was with the Japanese wrestlers. Now, in my juvenile mind, I have always thought this was Tyro Miyake who did this. Joe says it's Kenji Shibuya. I was 11, 12 years old, 13 years old maybe at this time, going to be turning 13. Joe would have been 33, 34, so I will concede to his memory. He says it was Shibuya. Basically, he was doing a live on-tape commercial for Busch Bavarian Beer, which was the sponsor of wrestling at the Chase from Anheuser-Busch. And in the middle of the interview, the two Japanese wrestlers came down. I thought Miyake said it. He says it was Shibuya, and he's probably right. He took the beer can, or the beer bottle, and he said, so Ichiban, Bushi Bavarian, Ichiban. And the other Japanese wrestlers staying there smiling and gloating. And they took a slug of the beer, and they kept saying, Ichiban. And, of course, Joe had to get an interpretation of what Ichiban meant. Number one. Number one. He said it was the greatest commercial he ever did because there was absolutely no planning. Just when they walked down, probably Sam had sent him down and said, why don't you go down there with Gary Joel and see how he reacts? Because there would always be this little bit of ribbing going on sometimes between them. He probably just sent him down to see what they do. And, of course, they did something, and Joe, being a total professional, reacted to it. And everybody in St. Louis was talking about, do you see those crazy Japanese wrestlers drinking the beer and say, Bushi, Bavarian, Ichiban? What the hell does Ichiban mean? Great stuff.
Okay, beautiful. April 1st, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, 11,682 sellout.
Another one-fall match, and NWA champion Pat O'Connor comes up with a victory over Gene Kiniski. I just remember that as a great match. I think they went like 35 minutes for the one fall. And plus, on the undercard, the Scott brothers, George and Sandy, were here against Shibuya and Miyake, and Shibuya and Miyake beat them 2 out of 3 falls.
Cowboy Bob Ellis defeats Nick Roberts. Rip Hawk over Ray Gordon. I remember Rip Hawk, as an older wrestler and, over the hill, past his prime.
Sure.
I can't, that's just how I envision him. How was he in 1960? Big legend in St. Louis, right?
Oh, tremendous. I mean, he was very active. His finish was a leap off the top. Well, you couldn't come off the top rope. It led to disqualification. So he had to change to jumping off the second rope. But whenever he could, he'd jump off the top rope on somebody. Very active. Got up in the air. But as much as anything, it was his personality that got him over here. Yeah. Such a character. One day on Wrestling at the Chase, something happened where Hawk and Kiniski were in the ring, and Joe Garagiola was needling them from the outside as usual. And you're hearing all this, of course, commentary. As Joe's needling them, they're yelling back. Something happened, and Kiniski and Hawk jumped outside the ring, and they started chasing Joe. And Joe began, he took one whole run around the ring before he got back to the commentator's table. Hawk and Kiniski went back in the ring for their match. Unplanned. Because afterwards, and Sam told me this story probably 25 times, and every time he told it to me the same, so I feel pretty comfortable he was correct. He said that I had no idea. He said, I was incensed because, number one, I thought, oh, this is horrible. What are they going to do if they catch him? And Joe's a friend of mine. What if he falls and breaks his leg or something? He says, so they come back to the dressing room and says, I just chewed Hawk and Kiniski up from one end to the other. He said, I just let them have it. He said they just stood there with their heads hanging down. Rip Hawk and Gene Kiniski, these two big tough guys, head hanging down, taking the butt kick from the verbal butt kick from Sam Muchnick. And he says later that night there was a place in South St. Louis known as the Redbird Lanes, of which Joe Garagiola owned a part, along with Stan Musial, Red Schoendienst, and a lot of the Cardinal baseball players. It was a kind of a hangout overnight, and people stopped there for sandwiches late at night. Sam says, I go in there to get a hamburger, and I hear people laughing, and it's kind of odd that late, people bowling that late. I look out there, and who's bowling but Rip Hawk, Gene Kiniski, and Joe Garagiola together. He says, I went out and talked to him, and he said, no, we didn't play at anything. He says, well, we do this all the time. He says, well, I felt a lot better after that because I thought maybe everybody was mad at everybody after I yelled at him. But Sam said, he said, they fooled me. He says, I had no idea. He said, it just happened naturally, and I was afraid that Joe had really gotten under their skin.
Yeah.
And I told him they just had to live with it. Then it turns out, no, they're hanging out. They're going bowling together after the show.
Just brush it right off.
Just brush it right off.
Okay, April 21st, the Thursday night, Kiel Auditorium, 1960.
One of the few Thursdays, Gene Kiniski beats Cowboy Bob Ellis in the main event, six-man tag underneath. It's not a terribly strong card, and I would think, looking back, those of you who have perpetual calendars, see if Good Friday may have been that Friday. Maybe that's why they ran on Thursday. But I don't know that as a fact. Could have been. Could have been.
Okay, this is the last one we're going to do for this episode. May 13th, 1960, Kiel Auditorium, attendance 10,000, NWA champion Pat O'Connor versus Gene Kiniski.
This time they go 2 out of 3 falls, and after a split of falls, Kiniski's disqualified in the third fall. So Kiniski is still right there as a legitimate challenger for O'Connor. O'Connor hasn't put him away. Tag match underneath, Miyake and Shibuya, who've come off their victory over the Scott brothers. But on May 13th, 1960, they lose to Cowboy Bob Ellis and Whipper Billy Watson. And for some reason, and I highlight this in our result package in the wrestling record book from St. Louis, Rip Hawk beats Gory Guerrero. It must have been a great match. I have this, as we talked about, these juvenile memories you have in your head, things that stick out. I look at this card, and the thing I remember more than anything else is Hawk and Guerrero just going like 100 miles an hour. So it must have been a great match, and it just sticks out that there was some history to that match. But by then, I'll tell you, wrestling at the Chase, St. Louis wrestling was on fire and was going to become on fire even more so over the next several years.
What was the reason that it was on fire? Because it just comes into St. Louis. What was it about it? Was it the way Sam was doing it? Was it the star power? The people were starved for it?
Everything you just named and a little bit more. Smart booking, a professional approach, letting the characters be characters, but knowing it's something Terry Funk told me when we talked, and I may have mentioned this before, where Terry said Sam understood that less is more, and Sam protected the business. He meant not just protected the business against the outside people who would criticize it, but he protected the business from itself. When people would let it get completely out of control in some territory, Sam knew just when to dial back, just when to put on the reins. For instance, Kiniski and Hawk chasing Joe Garagiola around. It wasn't something he wanted to happen, and he probably would have said it maybe perhaps in a different way. And don't forget, now we're talking to Sam Muchnick, who was, was he 55, 58 years old. A lot more fire, a lot more vigor, a lot more energy at the peak of his power as the NWA president. Well, not at the peak, because that would come throughout the 60s, but certainly close to the peak of his power. And he knew when to pull back just a little. Okay, we did it. That's enough. We did a Texas death match, but we're not going to do one every show. He knew how to protect the business, both from its critics and from itself. And for all the reasons, Gary, that you just named, this fabulous television show from a totally unique location, never matched anywhere else. Vince McMahon can go to every big arena in the world. He can go to even some large situations like a 70, 80,000 seat building, dome type building. It still won't look the same and feel the same as the Khorasan room did. and you had some characters, great personalities. People were hungry for it. Everything was in the right place at the right time with the right people, and that's what was happening in '59 and into 1960.
Larry, it's been a pleasure. Great show. You're the only person I know that could bring wrestling from the 1960s, 1959, 1960, right to life as if it was happening right before our eyes. It's really amazing.
Well, I hope anybody listening can get a little sense of it, because it was amazing. It was just an amazing era.